The Cold Case Confession. The Murder of Janet Couture. Part 1. The year was 1973. Nixon was in the White House, the Vietnam War raged on, and disco was just beginning to spin its way into American hearts. But in a quiet corner of New England, in a small town in Connecticut, something unthinkable happened that would haunt a family for half a century. Her name was Janet Couture. To those who knew her, Janet was a burst of kindness in human form. She was 20 years old, brimming with potential, with a laughter that made people turn their heads just to hear it again. She had the kind of smile that could calm a storm and an energy that seemed untouchable. On a spring evening in 1973, Janet left home, and she never came back. Her body was found shortly after, brutally murdered. For her family, time fractured that night. Days became blurred. The seasons rolled on, but the grief never dulled. Janet's mother would set a place at the table long after others said she should move on. Her father, quiet and stoic, aged seemingly overnight. Her siblings grew up in the shadow of her absence, knowing that their family story had been rewritten in blood. The police searched. They interviewed. They ran down leads, but every path went cold. In 1973, the science we rely on today didn't exist. DNA analysis wasn't even a concept in police departments. Forensic databases, they were decades away. A case like Janet's lived or died on eyewitnesses, on confessions, on someone breaking under questioning. But no one did. The file on Janet Couture eventually moved from the front of the desk, to a filing cabinet, to the depths of cold storage. And life, as it always does, trudged forward, except for Janet's family. For them, time was frozen. And then, out of nowhere, a name surfaced. George Legere. He wasn't a stranger. He had lived in the area. People remembered him, quiet, a little strange, with a darkness that seemed to follow him. But in 1973, there had been no evidence linking him directly to Janet. Rumors swirled, but rumors don't convict. And so George lived his life year after year, decade after decade, carrying a secret so heavy it should have broken him. Except he never broke. Not when Janet's mother passed away without answers. Not when her siblings built lives of their own, children and grandchildren who only knew of Aunt Janet from fading photographs. Not when anniversaries of her death were written in silence on family calendars. George Legere lived as if nothing had happened. But darkness like that doesn't go away. It festers. It eats. It corrodes. And then, in the most unexpected twist of all, George himself would speak. He would confess. But before that shocking revelation, we have to understand who George Legere really was, and why his name had lingered for decades like a ghost over Janet's unsolved murder. George wasn't extraordinary. In fact, that's what made him terrifying. He blended in. He worked jobs, he moved around, he slipped through society like smoke. To the outside world, he was just another man in the crowd. But beneath the surface, he carried rage, control, and a need for power. The ingredients of violence waiting for the right victim. Janet, bright and young and full of life, became that victim. The murder itself was brutal. Even decades later, investigators described it as personal, the kind of violence that doesn't come from random chance. This wasn't a mugging gone wrong. This wasn't an opportunistic attack. This was rage. And rage always leaves scars. But in 1973, with no confession, no DNA, and no witness strong enough to tie it down, George Legere simply slipped away. Years turned into decades. Janet's family begged for answers, but the world had moved on. New murders, new headlines, new tragedies stole the spotlight. For the Couture family, silence was louder than any breaking news bulletin. And then, just when it seemed like Janet's story would remain forever unsolved, George did something no one expected. He talked. Almost 52 years after Janet's death, the man who had lived with her murder in his chest finally confessed. But why? Why, after all these years, when he had gotten away with it, when time had almost erased memory, did George Legere finally open his mouth? That's where the story takes its most chilling turn. Because George's confession wasn't just about guilt. It wasn't just about remorse. It was about power. Even in admitting the truth, he wanted control. And as investigators sat across from him, tape recorders running, pens scratching furiously, they realized that justice, though delayed, had finally come knocking. But for Janet's family, the confession was not a clean victory. It was a reopening of wounds they had tried desperately to stitch closed. Because the truth, after 50 years, doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings pain so sharp it feels brand new. This is the story of a family's 5-decade nightmare. A murder hidden in plain sight. A man who lived among them all those years. And the confession that finally shattered the silence. And as we unravel George Legere's story in part 2, you'll see why the wait for justice nearly destroyed everyone it touched. Part 2. When detectives reopened the case, it wasn't because of some groundbreaking piece of new forensic evidence. This wasn't the kind of Hollywood story where DNA under a fingernail or a hair on a jacket magically solved everything decades later. No, this case cracked open because of something far more human and far more unsettling. George Legere talked. Not in a fit of guilt-ridden breakdown. Not in a teary moment of repentance. Well, George confessed because he wanted to. And that was the most terrifying part. The details of how his confession came about still chill investigators to this day. He was an old man now, gray with years carved deep into his face. He had lived a life, worked jobs, had neighbors, maybe even friends. And all that time he carried Janet Couture's murder in silence. But then, sitting across from detectives, he began to unravel the story. Piece by piece. Word by word. And it was cold. No tremor in his voice. No apology. Just flat, factual statements. As though he were describing the weather. "I killed her," he said. Just like that. The detectives who heard those words later said it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. For decades, Janet's family had begged, screamed, cried, prayed for those words. Now here they were. Only it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a monster taking one more victory lap. George laid out what happened that night in 1973. How he'd watched Janet. How he'd followed her. How, in his twisted mind, she represented something he could never have. Light, freedom, joy. He couldn't love her the way normal people love. He had to consume her. Destroy her. Make her his in the ugliest way possible. Investigators sat in silence, recording every word, their pens flying across notepads, but their stomachs turning at the sheer lack of humanity in his voice. For Janet's family, when the police broke the news, the emotions were complicated. Her younger sister, now in her 60s, said she had imagined this day 1,000 times. That the man who killed her sister would finally be named. But the reality of it shattered her. Because the confession didn't bring Janet back. It didn't fill the empty chair at family dinners. It didn't erase the birthdays missed, the milestones unshared. Instead, it brought a new wave of grief. A fresh, searing reminder of just how brutally Janet's life had been stolen, and how George had lived freely all these years. Janet's brother put it another way. He said, "It's like he killed her twice. Once in 1973, and again when he opened his mouth to tell us how." The community's reaction was just as conflicted. Some people were shocked. They had lived near George, seen him at the grocery store, passed him on the street, all while he carried this horror inside him. Others weren't surprised at all. They'd whispered his name for years, always suspecting but never daring to say it too loudly. Now their suspicions were confirmed. The case made headlines not because the world hadn't seen murder before, but because this was something uniquely cruel. A man who murdered and then buried the truth for half a century, only to resurrect it at the end of his life like one final act of control. Why did George confess? That's the question that haunted everyone. Some said it was guilt finally breaking him. Others believed it was vanity, that he wanted recognition even if it meant infamy. But the detectives who looked him in the eye said it wasn't guilt. Not even close. It was power. Think about it. For 50 years, George Legere had the ultimate secret. He alone knew what happened that night. He alone held the answers Janet's family begged for. And by speaking now on his terms, in his way, he reminded everyone who really held the power all along. That's what obsession does. That's what control looks like. And yet, even in this dark confession, there was one thing George Legere couldn't take away. The truth had finally come out. Janet's name was no longer buried in a cold case file. Her story was no longer trapped in whispers and rumors. It was loud, it was undeniable, and it was written down in official transcripts for history to remember. The trial, if you could call it that, wasn't about catching him. He had already confessed. It was about sentencing, about making sure his words didn't vanish into thin air. Prosecutors brought in every piece of evidence they could, reconstructing Janet's final night, not because they needed to convince a jury, but because Janet deserved to have her story told out loud in a court of law. Her family sat in the gallery, listening to every detail they already knew in their bones but hated to hear spoken aloud. They listened as Janet was brought back to life in testimony, only to be killed again in the retelling. They listened as George sat there, aged but unrepentant, his eyes empty, his lips tight. When the guilty verdict came down, some in the room wept. Others sat in silence, because justice that takes 50 years doesn't feel like justice at all. It feels like a ghost settling in your chest, whispering, "Too late, too late." But late or not, it was something. And for Janet's siblings, it was the closest thing they would ever have to closure. Outside the courthouse, reporters shoved microphones toward them, asking what they thought, what they felt. Her sister said quietly, "This isn't closure. Closure is a lie. This is acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is all you get." And maybe that's the lesson buried in Janet's story. That justice delayed isn't justice denied, but it comes at a cost. A cost her family will pay for the rest of their lives. Because while George Legere spent 50 years hiding in plain sight, Janet's laughter remained frozen in time. Her life stopped on that night in 1973 while his went on. He stole decades from her family, from a future that could have been. And when he finally confessed, the only thing left for anyone to do was bear witness. To listen. To remember. To make sure her story, and the cruelty of how long it took to get here, was never forgotten. So, when you think of George Legere, don't think of him as the man who confessed. Don't give him that power. Think of Janet. Think of the life she lived before he took it. Think of the family that carried her memory through decades of silence, through anniversaries marked not with cake but with tears. Because in the end, George Legere's name is just one more in a long list of men who thought they could control, possess, and destroy. But Janet's name? That's the one worth remembering. Janet Couture. 1973. Gone but not erased. And if her story teaches us anything, it's this. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't strangers in the night. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they live among us for 50 years. And sometimes when they finally speak, the words aren't redemption. They're a reminder of just how dark obsession and control can become. And that is the story of George Legere, the cold case confession. Thanks for watching. If you stayed to the end, it means you enjoyed our story. So please subscribe to get notifications when we post true stories like this again. And don't forget to like, comment, and share your suggestions for future cases you want us to cover. See you on the next one.